Can you hear me okay? Or how about now? Now, there we go, okay. All this technology. My 14-month-old grandson has a better understanding of technology. It's amazing, they'll sit there, he'll get out the phone and he knows how to do this right away. And they don't even really give him a lot of phone time. I mean, it's just he grabs it and starts doing it. But, so as mentioned, Jennifer and I were originally had planned to get out of my, after my initial 4 years that I owed the Air Force, I ended up spending 22 years in the Air Force, just because, as the saying goes, man plans and God laughs. And we were going to get out and become missionaries through the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention at the time, and go to Venezuela, where I would have been a bivocational missionary running a business, and then, but God said no. And we ended up moving, and ended up, kept getting promoted, so that was a good thing. And once you hit 10 years in the military, just hold your breath for the other half. And ended up staying in for 22 years, retiring as Lieutenant Colonel in 2010. And the Lord was able to use that time for us to prepare for what we're doing now. And that's the really cool thing. I mean, you don't see it when you're in the middle of it, but when God is shaping you and preparing you, and then you look back and you go, wow, I couldn't have planned that if I had tried. And I was licensed into the ministry in 1990. We were stationed in North Dakota. I was telling the pastor, we're glad to be back in this part of the country. We spent 6 years in North Dakota, spent a lot of time back and forth in Minnesota and all that stuff, so we're glad to be back here. We actually like cold weather. It doesn't bother us a bit. And this morning was a reminder of that. But ended up preaching in a lot of small churches throughout eastern North Dakota. I was on missile combat crew at the time I started out as a missile launch officer. So one of the guys is down with his hand on the button, but it's actually a key. But did that for 4 years and decided after 4 years I was tired of living underground and wanted to have an office with a window. And just by God's providence and everything else, and the degree that I ended up picking at Michigan State literally was anything to get out of math class, because I'm not a math guy. And it boiled down to history or telecommunications. And I love history, but it's not very practical unless you're getting a doctorate. So I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in telecommunications, which included training in journalism and broadcasting and mass communication. And so when I came off crew, it was very easy for me to become then a public affairs officer in the Air Force, a spokesman. So I said this, as I said earlier this morning, being in front of a podium, sure, I still get nerves, but it's second nature. I did this all the time. In the midst of that, God kept giving us opportunities to minister, whether it was with youth or with seniors or whatever, Sunday school, and started preaching more. In our first assignment overseas to Germany, we ended up attending an English-speaking church off base. It was primarily military, but there was some international too, but it was English-speaking. Ended up getting ordained out of that church in 2002. So I knew at that point I was in for the long haul with the Air Force, and knew that when I retired, I wanted to do something in ministry. I didn't know if it was pastoral or whatever. But in 2009, on my second trip to Iraq, the Air Force said, well, when you're back, you can either go to Afghanistan or the Pentagon. And I said, no, neither of those are an option. And called Jennifer and said, I think it's time to retire. And she said, it's a good time. Our kids were finishing up high school at that point. And so I was left with, okay, God, I'm ready to step out. And ended up working at Baptist Bible College, which is now Clark Summit University. It's in northeastern Pennsylvania. Did that for 3 years as an administrator, but then also an adjunct for their business department, and taught some classes. Really enjoyed it. Beautiful campus, loved being around students. But God called us to the home office for the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches, which this church and the Minnesota Association is part of. To move out to Chicago and take over as a marketing director for the Regular Baptist Press. So the garb has many facets to it. Again, we're not a denomination, we're an association. But through that cooperative coming together, we're able to do some things. Part of that is we have a press, so we do Sunday school, VBS VBS material Bible studies, we have an international arm, we have a church planting arm, and then we have the chaplaincy ministry, which in 2015 I ended up assuming, not even intending to. One of the roles that I had in addition to marketing is I had a lot of HR experience in the Air Force, so I was the HR director and was helping them transition from my predecessor. Some of you may have known John Murdoch, as he was retiring, helped them find somebody to take over the ministry. And so in the process, as we were going through this, long story short, we found out it was me. And the gentleman that we had selected at the last moment called, literally, it was a Friday afternoon, and he was supposed to start on Monday, and said, my wife and I this is where God is calling us. And the national rep at the time, John Green, called him up, and I said, Jennifer and I have been thinking about this, and maybe this is something I could do. I had reservations, because I said I was not a chaplain in the military, I was what they call a line officer. So I didn't have anything to bring per se directly to the chaplaincy table, other than 22 years of military experience, and then working with chaplains over the course of time, but never as a chaplain. And John, I love John and Derry, he just looked at me and he's like, well, I wanted you the whole time. And which I was very flattered. So I had to recuse myself from the process, had to go through the whole application just like everybody else did, and then the board confirmed me that in June of 2015. So I've just gone over 8.5 years doing this ministry. And we love it. And we never thought that in our time in the military that we would be in a position to be able to minister to our military through chaplains and getting our chaplains endorsed and out into the field. So it's been a real blessing to be able to do that. I'll just take a few minutes just to recap. So the chaplaincy ministry, in order to be a chaplain, particularly if it's your vocation, meaning you're paid for it, or military, as a military chaplain, you have to be endorsed. It's like anything else. It's a credential that says there is some board of authority over you that says, yes, you have the academic qualifications, you have the practical qualifications in order to be able to do this. And so the GAR became its own endorsing entity in 1987. The official nomenclature is Ecclesiastical Endorsing Body. And we are one of about 220, 230 religious bodies that the government recognizes as a bona fide religious organization that can endorse chaplains. And I was telling somebody earlier, it goes everything from Wiccan to Greek Orthodox and everything in between. So there's lots of ministry opportunity, but there's also a chaplain has to be able to work in a very pluralistic environment without compromising their doctrine. And so as an endorsing agent, we'll get somebody that's interested in chaplaincy ministry, whether it's in the military, whether it's institutional or vocational, like with a hospital where that's their job, or volunteer chaplains. It's all the same application process. It comes to me. We do an initial vetting, I do an initial vetting, and then it's sent off to several men that serve on our council of 18 who are all pastors. And they review the material, check the doctrine, make sure there's no questions or uncertainties or unclarities about what they believe and why they believe. All very reasonable questions. And then once they get through that process, then we can endorse them. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be hired as a chaplain, but they have to have that endorsement in order to do so. In the military, it's called a DD Form 2088, and it's a form that, I sign on behalf of the GRBC. I'm not the one that's sending them per se, but rather it is our association at the national level. And of course, state level feeding into that we send chaplains out to serve. And they serve in a variety of capacity. In the military, they are commissioned officers in the military. They have the same requirements and expectations of every other sailor, soldier, airman, guardian, and coastie as everybody else in Marine. They have the same expectations and requirements, have the same deployments, have the same challenges, but then they also are chaplains. So there's a lot on them. And there's a lot of expectation, and so we're very picky on who we send. Likewise with our institutional chaplains, they serve like in the Veterans Administration Hospital, they serve in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and then they can serve in private ventures, private hospitals and things like that. And as I mentioned earlier this morning, as a result of COVID, people, the medical community in particular, began to see the real value of spiritual resiliency and the importance of spiritual health when it comes to being able to recover from not just COVID, but just anything. And then, of course, chaplains also provide that end-of-life care, like during hospice visits and things like that. So they have a very important role. And then our community service chaplains are volunteers. They are typically, in many cases, not all cases by any means, pastors that want to get to know their community a little bit better. I'm a chaplain with our local police department where we live in Grand Blanc, Michigan. And it's an incredible opportunity to be able to get to know our officers and be a part of their lives, and be the one that gets called when there's a crisis, whether it's a personal crisis, or unfortunately, as we see, when there's been a mass shooting or a terrible accident. We're there as a first responder chaplain, not to the community per se. We would never turn down someone that's seeking, some kind of spiritual guidance. But we're there for the first responders and their families. That's what we're there for. And so it's a very unique opportunity. But we have chaplains that serve on sports teams, chaplains that serve in jails. We have both ordained and non-ordained chaplains. I had one of the ladies in the congregation this morning come up to me and asked can she be a chaplain? And I'm like, yes, you can, because we have lay chaplains. It doesn't require ordination. And as association, of course, we do not recognize the ordination of women, but it doesn't mean they cannot serve in a very critical role in ministry as a chaplain. And so we have chaplains that serve in political arenas. We have chaplains that serve in jails, a whole variety of places where they can serve. So that's the ministry in a nutshell. And we've got some material out there. Jennifer and I are happy to answer any questions that you might have. Our website, regularbaptistchaplaincy.org, has everything you need to know about how to become a chaplain, has the application process. And if anybody has any questions, my contact information is available. I'd be happy to talk to you and share with you about the chaplaincy. So with that, what I wanted to share with you this morning, as mentioned, I'm the director and endorser is the official title. I'm a one-man shop. Like I said, our home office is in Elgin, Illinois, but Jennifer and I moved back to Michigan about 4.5 years ago. That's our home, and so we're glad to be back out of there. It's something I can work remotely from. I don't need to be in our home office in order to do it. But I've been doing it now for 8.5 years, and it is a pleasure for me. I was excited when Jim called me earlier this spring and mentioned this round robin, that we love getting out and meeting our churches and our people within the churches and sharing what this ministry is. And so to have a round robin week where I think it's 4 or 5 different churches, it's a lot of speaking this week, but it's great. I'm looking forward to it. To be able to come out and again share those things. And like I said, one of the highlights is meeting people face to face, answering questions. And a lot of people don't really know about the chaplaincy. But chaplains have a unique call. They are there to listen. Certainly they're there about sharing Christ. They are there to encourage. They are there to counsel. They are there to comfort. They are there to care. And that requires a certain amount of leadership. Actually, a great deal of leadership. Because chaplains often are functioning either as this sole or one of just 2 or 3 maybe other chaplains in an environment that is very heavily secular, whether it's the military or a police department or a fire department or a hospital. So they have to be able to stand up to that leadership challenge. They are the touch point in an organization. They are often the only religious touch point, let alone being a Christian. So they have to be willing to flex to their circumstances and be ready for just about anything. And the Bible is full of examples of men and women who have demonstrated leadership while honoring God in the process. And I want to highlight one of those men here in just a moment. As mentioned, I spent nearly 22 years in the Air Force. It was 21 years, 7 months, and 10 days, but who was counting? And from the very first day as an Air Force ROTC cadet to the day I hung up my uniform for the last time, every day had its own leadership challenge. From small to the truly significant. From what color do we use on this brochure to when I was deployed, the implications of having to send out a team into a combat area. So every decision required some kind of thought behind it. Decisions that needed to be made with consequences impacting money, time, people, often all three. And someone argued that leaders are born and not made. Others would say anyone can be a leader with the right training and in the right environment. And in my experience, I would say reality lies somewhere in between all that. There are some that have a natural inclination, but I think there are certainly those that can be taught how to be better leaders. But there are those that rise to the role of leader in a given situation based on their training, based on circumstances. We all have encountered that, either personally or been around someone in that situation. And I'm sure we all have people in mind of whom we would attribute the moniker leader to. While I was in the Air Force, I had the opportunity to get a couple of graduate degrees, and one of them was in training and development, a master's in education, more like adult learning, adult training. But there was a learning model that was called the API model, and it had to do with learning and process of learning. But I found over time it was very applicable in a leadership model mindset as well. And API stands for Analyze, Plan, Implement, and Evaluate. We call it a rolling donut. It's a perpetual process. And one of the men that I love the story of in the Bible is Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is a prime example of a man who was a leader. And his story is amazing. Nehemiah was a Jew. And he was an important servant, a cupbearer to the king of Persia, Artaxerxes. And the book of Nehemiah starts with Nehemiah in the region of Shushan, where the king had a palace, a summer home, if you will, and would stay during the winter months. Nehemiah was not a prince, he was born in captivity, but yet he was in the court of the king with a position of high trust and responsibility, much like Daniel, who we used as an example during the 8:30 hour. Nehemiah, the name means the comfort of Jehovah. And this was not the first time God would put what would be a person, appear to be a person who's out of place, such as a Jew, in a place of close proximity to leadership. In addition to Daniel, Esther is another prime example of that. And Nehemiah was very interested in the city of Jerusalem, and especially the destroyed temple. In one commentary, the author sees Nehemiah as being very patriotic, and I'm inclined to agree with that. You know, we're seeing everything that's going on in Israel and the destruction, and we're seeing that area being battled over again and again and again, as it has through history. And in this case, Nehemiah was very, very concerned about the gates. And it's reflected in his very first words of the book, starting in verse 2 of chapter 1, that Hananiah, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. You can imagine what he was going through it, and I liken this example to 9/11. We were stationed in Germany at the time of 9/11. I was a war planner, and we got there in 2000, and we're enjoying living in Europe and everything that goes on with that privilege of being able to live overseas. And then, of course, 9/11 happened. And I remember that morning very vividly and very clearly. Of course, in Germany, it was an afternoon event because we were 6 hours ahead of everybody. And as I mentioned, I was a war planner, and I was back in the vault, and we had TVs on because we were a public affairs office, so we had regular interaction with the media. We needed to know what was going on. And I came out, and just as I came out, the first plane hit the tower. And we were watching it live. And everybody's attention went to going on. As you recall, there was speculation that, it was a light airplane that had gotten lost in the fog or something like that. There were all these speculations. But then when the second airplane hit, everybody knew what was going on. And then, of course, we heard about the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. And then the plane that hit the Pentagon. And I remember feeling helpless. If you recall, and looking at most of you in the audience, we remember that. Some of you were either very young or may not have even been born yet. But the immediate response from the U.S. government was they grounded every airplane that was in the air. Every airplane. Now, can you imagine the logistics of that? And that, of course, meant that people that were back in the U.S. on vacation or on business could not get back overseas. In fact, our director was trapped in Texas during all that time. But I just remember how helpless we felt. They immediately recalled the Crisis Action Team, CAP, and as the war planner for the directorate, I had to go to that meeting, and we immediately kicked into war mode. I called Jennifer and I said, just get the boys and get home. And we lived off base. I said, they're getting ready to shut the base. You need to go home, and I'll be home when I get home. And over the next few days, there was just this outpouring of emotion and response, and even media that was normally hostile that we had to deal with could set aside their bias and recognize the tragedy that had happened and express sincere condolences, not just from American press, but from international press as well. But I remember just feeling helpless because there's nothing you could do. It was like having a family member die and you can't get home to the funeral. And that's how I imagine Nehemiah felt. Everything that was familiar to him had been destroyed, people killed, you have some remnants, the gates were destroyed. He just knew he had to do something. So in that first step of leadership, the first thing he had to do was analyze the situation, which is exactly what we did in the Crisis Action Team. We analyzed what was going on, and from there we'd pull out various war plan scenarios, but we had to figure out what was going on before you can decide what you can do. So his reaction was not to get angry and respond with rashness, but in Nehemiah's case, in brokenness, he confesses by truly analyzing the situation and the root of the problem. Starting in verse 4, as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant. And I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the people of Israel, which have sinned against you. Even I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, and the rules that you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word that you have commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather them and bring them to a place that I have chosen to make my name dwell there. Unlike what is so popular today, Nehemiah assumed responsibility for himself and for the children of Israel. His first analysis response is, what have I done to create this situation? And in those verses, we see a genuine outpouring of regret and lament for the state that not only he, but all of Israel had been at that point. A good leader analyzes first what are the things he or she can control and have responsibility for. Nowadays, when something goes wrong, it's get mad, get angry, and blame somebody else. Not take responsibility for what is going on. But a good leader does that. And after his honest reflection, he seeks the Lord's forgiveness. Carrying on in verse 10, they are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. For Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. And give success to your servant today and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was a cupbearer to the king. Could you imagine, with all that we've seen in our country within the past few years, if we had just stopped as a nation and repented and sought God's forgiveness and as objectively as possible analyze the situation and figure out, how did we get here? And when you do that, when you stand back objectively, and that can be very hard to do. It's very hard to separate yourself from emotion, which makes a response subjective, to one that is thought out clearly. And as believers, we have that ability. We have the wisdom of the Lord to be able to stand back at a situation and honestly ask ourselves, how did I get here? You know, how many cases have we heard where there's been a downfall of a pastor or any figure whatsoever, whoever, that if they honestly stood back, it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to sin today. Oh, I'm going to fail today. There's usually a series of events that take you up to that point, and you have to be objective in looking at that, and that's exactly what Nehemiah did. And Nehemiah knew exactly what brought them there. And that was they just cast out God. And don't get me wrong, I love our country and I'm a deep patriot. But we have casted out God. And so we're reaping that mentality. But one of the bright spots out of that is people are seeing that governments fail people. People fail people. But God does not. So to me, the time is prime and ripe for revival, because people are looking for truth. Study after study shows that the youth of this generation that's coming up are seeking things other than the things that you and I in our generation sought. You know, there was a push of materialism and self, and, you know, if it feels good, do it, and blah, 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 blah. But you have youth, this generation is coming up, that realize that there's a shallowness to that. And hopefully some will find God, but they're finding something to fill that with. Nehemiah was able to step back, analyze the situation, and answer the question honestly. So starting in chapter 2, Nehemiah embarks on the second step in the leadership model, and that is to plan. As mentioned, we were stationed in Germany, and my role as the chief of plans for headquarters United States Air Force's Public Affairs, Air Force's Bureau of Public Affairs, I was responsible for all the public affairs annexes for the war plans, the overall war plans. That would include media engagement, messaging. Otherwise, how do we tell war? How are we going to do this? Are we going to embed media in aircraft? Are we going to embed media with ground troops? What are we going to do? How are we going to explain that to them? There were two types of planning. You had your deliberate plans and your contingency plans. And deliberate plans were plans that were written before a crisis. They were a template. That way, when a crisis did come, and crises always come, you'd use that deliberate plan to build your crisis plan. And every good planner knows that any plan is only as good as first contact with the enemy. And then that's what they call ad hoc planning. So Nehemiah begins to build his plan. Chapter 2, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? There is nothing but sadness of the heart. And I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let my king live forever. Why should not my face be sad, when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, then you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I might rebuild it. And the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Nehemiah was very careful not to assume on the good king's good grace to allow him to go back. And a good leader does not take for granted all the factors that can impact a plan. Our oldest son is mentioned as an aircraft commander in the Air Force. And an integral aspect of his flying is planning. As much time, if not more, is spent planning for the flight than the actual flight itself. It takes into consider every potential factor of the flight. Weather, weight, wind, you name it. Our youngest son is a Michigan State Trooper, and they are constantly training to understand and plan their response to a myriad of potential scenarios and outcomes. So having a plan is critical to any kind of success. So then Nehemiah takes the planning to the next level when in verses 7 through 8 he asks the king for a letter of safe passage. I like to say literally an over the river and through the wood document that lets him get to where he needs to be. As well as the building materials necessary to rebuild the gates. And of course what's really cool about that is that the king not only gives him all that, but also sends troops with him. And the king said, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come through Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates, and of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked for, and the good hand of my God was upon me. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. And now the king had sent me with my officers of the army, and horsemen. So this is an amazing testimony to Nehemiah as to the level of respect in regard the king and queen had for him. The very fact that he was in the king's presence and having a mopey face could have very well got him killed. He was not there to emote. He was there to be the cupbearer. That is a testimony to Nehemiah's love for the Lord and faithfulness and steadfastness. So upon his arrival at Jerusalem, Nehemiah tells us that he spent 3 days surveying the area to give him the foundation for his plan. Carrying on in verse 11. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went up by night by the valley gate to the bread and spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went to the fountain gate in the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley, inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. So in these verses, he's going to the different gates, considering their state. And just as an engineer might look at a bridge in need of repair, began evaluating the work that needed to be done, getting out his slide rule and his calculator and his protractor and everything else, and start looking at everything and taking notes and figuring out, okay, what needs to be done. And then much like a war plan, what is the desired end state? Every good war plan has an end state. And the term we use in war planning is called mission creep. And that's where you let the rabbit chasing take you down where you don't want to go. And I'll give you a prime example for those of you who remember the first Gulf War back in 1990 and 91, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. There's a lot of question of, well, why didn't we go after Saddam Hussein then? That was not our end state. Our end state was to kick Iraq out of Kuwait. Now, you could go back and armchair quarterback a lot of that and say, well, if we'd done this, we wouldn't have had to go back, a few years later. We never would have had 9/11, et cetera, and all those other things that go on. But the fact of the matter was, that was the end state. And not get distracted by the things that will take you off task. So Nehemiah looked at the gates and looked at the wall what needed to be done, and not get caught up in the chaff, the distractions that would take him away from that purpose. So he analyzed the situation. He planned the situation. And the plan doesn't do you any good unless you implement it. Beginning of verse 17, then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them that the hand of God, my God, that had been put upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. Verse 19, but when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Amorite servant, and Geshem, the Arab, heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you were doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Then I replied to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise to build. But you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. Nehemiah was thorough and thoughtful in his plan, and it was time to get to work. If you read on in chapter 3, there's a testimony to Nehemiah's leadership and how he brought together all these men to rebuild the wall. An important aspect of good leadership is good leadership surrounds themselves with better people and delegates the authority for them to do what needs to be done. Any of us that have ever been in any kind of work situation where we are micromanaged know how miserable it is, because nothing gets done when there's a single person directing everything. A healthy organization should thrive even when the leadership is gone. Nehemiah rallied his men, and they were able to get things going. And as mentioned, a good plan is only as good as first contact with the enemy. Chapter 4 through the half of chapter 6 describe those contacts with the enemy. Nehemiah faced ridicule, the discouragement of the Jews rebuilding the wall, sin, greed, even plots against his life. And in every case, he responded not in fear or rash reaction, but as a leader committed to seeing the plan implemented to its completion. He never let anything take him off task. Never let anything take his focus off what was needed to be done. He responded with prayer, faith, determination, integrity, and fairness, just to name a few. And in doing so, he not only hit his end state, but just in 52 days. I don't know about you here in Minnesota, but we have roads that have been worked on for 4 years in Michigan. And they can't seem to get a task done. And they're over budget, and they're over time, and traffic is a constant star. For a period of about 3 weeks, they had every road out of our town being worked on. It was impossible to get out of town. And like, which wizard figured that one out? But here in Nehemiah, because he stayed on task, demonstrated leadership, got it done in 52 days. My guess would probably be it was under budget too, just because. Nehemiah was a leader. And lastly, a good leader always evaluates the previous action taken. And for Nehemiah, his evaluation was in all things to give God the glory. The wall was finished. In verse 7, Nehemiah proceeds to put in place new leadership. A good leader always plans for his or her replacement. That was the first thing that when I became a squadron commander in the Air Force. It's only a 2-year assignment. And the first thing my boss said is, be prepared and make ready for your replacement, just as the person you replaced did for you. The wall was finished. He gave charge of Jerusalem over to Hananiah and Hananiah. Hananiah in particular was noted for being God-fearing, and he planned for the new population of the city. Those who were Jews, loyal and devoted to God. Clans and communities, professionals and vocationalists. His concern and passion for Jerusalem allowed him to be used by God to rebuild the city walls. He was a leader throughout. He assessed, he planned, he implemented, and finally evaluated. The success based on the glory brought to God. What we do in the military is we do what's called a JULES, or a hot wash, and it's a Joint Uniform Lessons Learned. So after every exercise or any kind of military action, you go back and you evaluate what worked and what didn't work, so that you can then take those lessons learned and implement them into the next plan. It's a constant learning experience. There's so much going on in our country, and so much that's going on in the world. And the worst thing we can do is sit on our hands. Each one of us is called to lead. Doesn't mean each one of us is called to lead a great army or whatever, but each of us is called to lead, to stand up, make a contribution. Always with the idea that it is for God's glory that something is being done, just as Nehemiah did. He understood that when he has that right, everything else can fall into place. But when we let another priority or another wild goose hunt take our way off what God has called us to do, that's when we run into problems and that's when we fail. Nehemiah was a leader. And I preach on this because our chaplains are leaders. They are called into an environment where they, as mentioned, are often the only religious, let alone Christian presence. They have to be able to minister to those of all faith backgrounds and no faith backgrounds. And they have to do it in a way that is honoring to God, consistent with what we believe, and doing what God has called them to do. Just as Nehemiah answered that call. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the example that you give to us through your word in so many ways and through so many people. And Lord, I pray each one of us would evaluate our hearts and that we are called, see that we are called to do something. Help us to be obedient and discerning as to what it is you call us to do. And that we would be faithful in stepping out and doing it. There's no greater example of leadership than through your Son, Christ. And Father, I pray that everything that we do would be for his greater glory and for his sake. For it's in his name we pray.